He leaned close to her ear, the woman who was not his bride, and whispered it like a promise. After today, everything is ours. 20 minutes before the ceremony, 200 guests waiting downstairs, and Amani Caldwell, standing frozen in a corridor she was never supposed to enter, heard every word. She had spent 14 months believing Seo Tai-jin was different, that a man that powerful could still choose her. Not her name, not her family's freight empire on Lake Michigan, not the Caldwell trust that her father bled 30 years to build. Her. And in 20 minutes, she was supposed to walk down that aisle and hand him her future with both hands. She almost did. If you've ever trusted someone completely, and then discovered the trust was the weapon, you already know what happened next inside Amani's chest. Stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what Amani does in the next 2 hours will change everything. Hit like, drop a comment with your city and country so I can see how far this story travels. And don't go anywhere, because it gets so much worse before it gets better. The morning had started the way Amani always feared important mornings would, with too much noise and not enough air. Her mother Loretta had arrived at 7 with 3 garment bags, a box of pins, and the specific brand of anxious cheerfulness she deployed whenever she was terrified something was about to go wrong. Loretta Caldwell was 61 years old and had spent the last 4 decades learning to read every room before she entered it. She had read this one. She just hadn't said anything yet. Amani's older brother Malcolm had shown up an hour later with coffee he'd bought from the wrong place, wearing a suit that needed pressing, and the expression of a man who had something to say and had decided against it 3 separate times before walking through the door. Malcolm was 34. He and Amani had been arguing and protecting each other in roughly equal measure since she was old enough to reach the kitchen counter. He looked at Tai-jin's framed photograph on the vanity table and looked away again. Nobody said anything about that either. The estate was Tai-jin's doing, a private property 40 minutes outside Chicago, sitting above Lake Michigan like it owned the waterfront, which technically it did. It had 14 bedrooms, a main hall with a 30-foot ceiling, and the kind of silence between rooms that told you the walls were thick enough to absorb sound, or secrets. Amani had toured it twice before settling on it as a venue. She'd thought the privacy was romantic, a ceremony just for them, insulated from the city's noise and gossip and opinion. She understood now that privacy had been the point. The dress had taken 40 minutes to get into correctly, and during those 40 minutes, Amani had stood still, while other people's hands worked around her body and thought about her father. Raymond Caldwell had died 2 years ago March, in a hospital room that smelled like recycled air and hand sanitizer, with Amani on one side of his bed and Malcolm on the other, and Loretta standing at the window because she could not watch his face go still. He had built Caldwell Freight Terminal from a single leased warehouse and a second-hand truck. 30 years of early mornings and missed dinners and handshake deals that he honored whether or not the other party did. He left it to all 3 of them equally, with specific instructions. Don't let anyone turn this into something I wouldn't recognize. Amani had taken those instructions seriously. She had spent the past 18 months learning every facet of the terminal, the dock operations, the union contracts, the customs relationships, the aging infrastructure that needed capital and care. She had not been trained for it. Raymond had assumed she'd marry someone and be comfortable. That was the one thing he'd gotten wrong about her. She had also, somewhere in those 18 months, fallen in love with Tai-jin. That part had felt real. She needed it to have been real. Tai-jin had appeared in her world through a mutual contact at a logistics conference, one of those events where everyone wears a lanyard and pretends they're not sizing each other up. He'd been standing near a window with a glass of something he wasn't drinking, and he'd said something dry and accurate about the panel discussion they'd both endured, and Amani had laughed before she'd finished deciding whether to. I was Korean-American, 34, built with the careful stillness of a man who had learned early that showing effort was a form of vulnerability. He ran what presented itself to the world as a logistics and real estate company. He ran it very well. What Amani had not known, what she'd believed were rumors from jealous competitors, was that the CO Syndicate's legitimate surface was exactly that, a surface. She'd asked him about it once, directly, the way she asked about everything that mattered to her. He'd looked at her with an expression she'd read as honesty and said, Some people need a story to tell about men who succeed on their own terms. Don't believe every story. She had chosen to believe him instead. 14 months. Enough time to learn someone's coffee order, their silences, the specific quality of their attention when they were actually listening versus when they were calculating. Amani had thought she knew the difference. She was smart. The kind of smart that had kept Caldwell Freight running through a market that would have eaten a less capable manager alive. She was also, she understood now, the kind of smart that occasionally protected itself by refusing to complete a thought. At 10:47, she realized she'd left the bridal bouquet in the corridor near the east wing. It was a small thing. She could have sent someone. She didn't because the morning had been full of other people moving around her and making decisions, and she wanted 60 seconds alone in a hallway without someone asking if she needed water or if the neckline was sitting correctly. She went herself. The corridor was quiet. The estate's east wing was where Tai Jin had set up a private office for the day, somewhere to manage the inevitable phone calls that his operation required even on a Saturday morning in an ivory tuxedo. The door was mostly closed, the way doors are when someone assumes they're private but hasn't checked. Amani heard Sarah first. Sarah was Tai Jin's financial strategist. Amani had met her 6 times and disliked her with a precision she'd never fully examined. Sarah was elegant in the way that requires active maintenance. Every element of her appearance considered, nothing accidental. She spoke to Amani with a warmth that was technically flawless and emotionally absent, the way a very good actor plays a supporting role they're slightly above. Amani had told herself she was being uncharitable. Sarah's voice through the gap in the door was lower than usual, stripped of its social register. After the signing, the trust documents move first, or the freight authority? Taejin's answer came without hesitation. Freight authority. The terminal is the asset. The trust is just the container. And if she pushes back once she's read them? A pause. Not the pause of a man who didn't have an answer. The pause of a man deciding how much to say out loud. She won't read them today. Today she's emotional, happy. She'll sign where she's told to sign because she trusts the people who prepared the documents. That's been the entire architecture. The entire architecture. Imani's hand was on the wall. She wasn't sure when she'd put it there. You've been patient, Sarah said, and there was something in her voice that was not professional admiration. I've been strategic, Taejin corrected. Patience implies waiting for something uncertain. I've been managing a timeline. And she has no idea. She has a version of the idea I gave her. She thinks she's marrying someone who understands power because he lives inside it the same way she does. She thinks we're equals. A sound. Maybe a glass being set down. She'll be useful as a partner. She's capable. The terminal will run better with her managing it directly. As long as you control the authority structure behind it. As long as the right signatures are in the right places. Amani stood in the corridor and breathed. She did not make a sound. She would wonder later how that was possible, how a person could absorb that much information in that short a time and remain physically still. Her body understood something her mind was still processing, that if she moved, if she made a noise, if the door opened and Taejin looked into the corridor and saw her face, she would have no advantage left, and she needed every advantage she had. Her phone was in her hand. She didn't remember taking it out. She opened the voice memo application, the one she used for recording notes during site visits at the terminal when she didn't want to type. Her thumb found the record button. She held the phone toward the gap in the door. Document was prepared before the Harlow Amendment cleared, Sarah was saying. We may need a second signature page. We have one. It's in the folder with the reception documents. She'll receive it with the rest of the paperwork. Her attorney is not in the room for any of this. Camille Rhodes is good. Camille Rhodes isn't here today. Amani didn't want work to touch the ceremony. A sound that might have been appreciation. She has principles about compartmentalization. They've been very useful. Imani recorded for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Then she walked back down the corridor the way she'd come, quietly, with the control of a woman who has just been handed a problem that requires her complete competence and has no room for anything else. She found her bouquet on the table near the south staircase. White roses. She had chosen them because Taejin mentioned once that he found elaborate floral arrangements performative, and she had filed that away as a sign of his authenticity. She held them and thought about her father's voice. Don't let anyone turn this into something I wouldn't recognize. In the bridal suite, she sat down in front of her own reflection and looked at her own face until she recognized herself again. Then she opened the legal folder Taijin's assistant had placed with her belongings. A manila envelope marked post-ceremony documents, bride's copy, and read every page. The forged addendum was on page 7. It was a 3-paragraph document granting preliminary management authority over Caldwell Freight Terminal operations to a company called CO Meriton Logistics Group. The authority was described as transitional, temporary, and administrative. The language was designed to sound like a reasonable operational arrangement. Imani's signature was at the bottom. She had never seen this document before in her life. She recognized the signature. It was hers. The specific slant of the I, the way the loop of the M sat slightly above the line. She had a habit of pressing harder on the downstrokes. Whoever had reproduced it had paid attention to that. She sat for a moment with the folder open in her lap. Then she called Camille Rhodes. Camille picked up on the second ring. Imani could hear ambient noise. She was at a restaurant, or maybe a coffee shop. Saturday morning. Normal life happening somewhere in Chicago, while Imani sat in an estate above Lake Michigan in an ivory gown holding evidence of her own forgery. "I need to send you something right now," Imani said. "I need you to look at it before you do anything else today." "Imani, your ceremony starts in—" "I know when my ceremony starts." Her voice came out flat and steady in a way she hadn't planned. "I'm sending you an audio file and a photograph of a document. I need you to tell me if what I'm looking at is what I think it is." A silence on Camille's end. Camille Rhodes had been Imani's attorney for 3 years and had learned in that time that Imani Caldwell did not panic and did not dramatize. When she said something was a problem, it was a problem. "Send them," Camille said. Imani sent them. Then she asked her mother and Malcolm to come into the bridal suite. Loretta came in already braced, the way she always knew, before she knew. Malcolm came in with his coffee and took one look at Imani's face and put the coffee down. "Close the door," Imani said. She told them everything. She played the recording once. She showed them the addendum. She watched her mother's face move through disbelief and then into the specific cold that Loretta Caldwell reserved for situations that required her to be dangerous. Malcolm said nothing for almost a full minute. Then, "We need to move the cars." "We're not moving anything yet," Imani said. "Imani, I know what I'm doing." There was a knock at the door. She knew before it opened. Taijin stood in the doorway in his ivory tuxedo, and whatever was on his face when he'd started down the corridor had been replaced by something smooth and calm and entirely constructed. He looked at the room, at Loretta's stillness, at Malcolm's expression, at the legal folder open in Imani's lap. The smooth thing on his face shifted. Not much. Enough. "Give us the room," he said. "No," Imani said. He looked at her. Something happened behind his eyes. A rapid assessment, a calculation running in real time. He stepped inside anyway, partially, keeping the door angle in his control. "There's been a misunderstanding about some documents," he said. Sarah was running projections, hypothetical restructuring scenarios. "The addendum is a draft that was filed incorrectly. It has no legal authority." "My signature is on it," Imani said. "I didn't sign it." "The signature error will be corrected immediately. This is an administrative mistake that I recorded your conversation with Sarah." The words landed in the room and didn't move. Taijin's face went through something she had never seen before. Not in 14 months, not in arguments, not in negotiations, not in moments of intimacy. For approximately 3 seconds, Seo Taijin looked like a man standing on ground that had just disappeared. Then he recovered. That was almost worse. "There are 200 people downstairs," he said quietly. "Politicians, business partners, people connected to both our families. If this ceremony doesn't happen, I know who's downstairs," Imani said. "The fallout from a cancellation at this stage will create a narrative that neither of us controls. Your family's reputation, my family is in this room," Imani said, "and we'll manage our own reputation." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She thought about the recording. She thought about page 7. She thought about her father's handwriting on the trust documents he'd signed before the hospital, the careful way Raymond Caldwell had written her name in the margin next to the terminal's succession clause. She thought about the fact that Taijin had studied her grief and turned it into a key. She took off the engagement ring. It came off easier than she expected. Her hands were cold. She set it on the vanity table next to his photograph. Then she picked up her bouquet. "I'm going downstairs," she said. Taejin's jaw moved. "Imani." She walked past him into the corridor and down the east staircase. Not the bridal staircase, the service one. The one that came out near the side of the main hall rather than the center. She walked through a door and 200 people turned toward her and the room went quiet. In that particular way. Rooms go quiet when everyone present understands simultaneously that something has gone wrong. She stood at the head of the room in her white dress with her white roses and looked at the people her almost husband had assembled as witnesses to his acquisition of everything her father had built. Then she spoke clearly, without a tremor, into the silence. "I need to tell you all something before we go any further." The room did not erupt all at once. It went quiet first, the particular quiet of 200 people inhaling at the same moment, and then it fractured, table by table, section by section, the way ice cracks from the center outward. Imani stood at the head of the hall in her ivory dress and watched it happen and did not look away from a single face. She had told them in 4 sentences. She had discovered in the hour before the ceremony that documents bearing her forged signature had been prepared to transfer operational authority over her family's freight terminal to a company controlled by Taejin's organization. She had recorded a conversation confirming the arrangement was intentional. The wedding would not proceed. She was sorry for their time. 4 sentences. Less than 90 seconds. That was all it took to undo 14 months of architecture. The noise that followed was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was the noise of 200 people trying to process information that contradicted the version of the day they'd agreed to inhabit. Chairs scraped. Someone near the back asked a question that nobody answered. A woman in a green dress near the center table put her hand over her mouth. Not from shock, Imani thought, but from the specific social discomfort of having witnessed something she hadn't consented to witness. Imani set her bouquet on the nearest table. She didn't need to hold it anymore. She turned and walked back toward the side corridor she'd come through, and she was almost to the door when she heard his footsteps behind her. Not hurried, never hurried, but close enough that she felt the shift of air. "Imani." She kept walking. "Imani." His hand closed around her wrist. Not hard, not violent, the grip of a man who had learned that the appearance of force was less effective than its implication. She stopped because stopping was her choice, not because his hand made her stop. She turned around. Up close, with the ambient noise of the dissolving reception behind them and no audience in the immediate corridor, Taejin's face had changed again. The smooth constructed calm was mostly intact, but there was something running underneath it now. Not panic, not guilt, not the emotions Imani had expected. Something that looked disturbingly like calculation still in progress. He had not stopped planning. He was still in the middle of it. "You just destroyed something that took 14 months to build," he said. His voice was low. Not angry. Lower than angry. "I destroyed your plan," Imani said. "Not the same thing. You destroyed your own credibility in front of every significant business relationship your family has in this city. You know who's in that room. You know what those people will say tomorrow morning. I know exactly who's in that room. You invited them. That was intentional too." Something moved in his face. The calculation paused for half a second. "You knew," she said. "You knew that if I found out during the ceremony, the size of the audience would make me hesitate. You built that into it. 200 witnesses to my silence. You're upset. I'm recording this conversation," she said. She was not. Her phone was in her dress pocket and she had not pressed record, but she watched his face absorb the possibility and go still. And she noted that Seo Taejin, who operated a criminal organization with enough sophistication to forge a digital signature from a charitable document signed months earlier, was not willing to test that particular risk. His hand released her wrist. "There are ways to resolve this quietly," he said. "The document was a mistake. The conversation you recorded was taken out of context. You told Sarah that my signature was already in the right places. Those were your exact words." She held his gaze. "What context makes that a misunderstanding?" He said nothing. That was its own kind of answer. "I'm going to find my family," Imani said. "Don't come to that room again." She left him standing in the corridor. Malcolm was already downstairs by the time she reached the suite. He'd moved fast. Malcolm always moved fast when the situation clarified itself into something requiring action rather than consideration. He had his phone in one hand and his jacket in the other, and the expression he got when he'd already run 3 scenarios and settled on one. "Camille called," he said. "She's been through the recording and the document. She says the signature reproduction is sophisticated enough that it would take forensic analysis to prove forgery in court, but the chain of custody for the original document, whatever Imani actually signed, is going to be traceable." "It was a charitable grant form," Imani said, "for the Raymond Caldwell Memorial Scholarship Fund. I signed it in October." Malcolm's jaw set. The scholarship fund had been his idea. He had researched the nonprofit structure himself and asked Imani to sign the initial paperwork and mailed it himself. He looked at her for a moment, understanding the specific violation of that the document Taijin's people had used to steal her signature had been connected to their father's name. "Camille says we freeze everything today," he said. "She already started. I told her to move before the ceremony." Loretta was sitting in the chair by the window. She had not cried, which meant she was past crying, which meant she was in the specific territory Loretta Caldwell occupied when the situation had moved beyond her emotional range into something colder and more durable. She was looking at the lake. "His people are already working the room," she said without turning around. "I can see it from here. 2 of them moving table to table. The man in the dark gray suit near the east entrance has been on his phone since you walked back in." Imani went to the window and stood beside her mother. She could see the estate's main terrace from here, guests spilling out from the hall, clusters of conversation forming and reforming. A man she recognized as a city alderman was talking very intently to his wife and looking up at the building. 2 women in identical postures of performed shock were taking photographs they would post within the hour. And yes, the man in dark gray, moving with the specific purposefulness of someone executing instructions rather than reacting to events. "He's managing it already," Imani said. "He started the moment you left that room," Loretta said. "That's who he is," Malcolm said from across the room. "His car hasn't moved. He's still in the building." "He won't leave until he's done something," Imani said. "Leaving without a countermove isn't how he operates." She said it neutrally, factually, the way she'd say anything else she'd learned to be true. It came out sounding more like damage than analysis, and she heard that in her own voice and said nothing more about it. Her phone rang. Unknown number, Chicago area code. She answered because not answering felt like hiding. The voice was male, mid-40s by pitch, with the specific flatness of a man who spent most of his life on calls he found inconvenient. "Miss Caldwell, my name is Warren Chu. I represent several of Mr. Seo's business interests, and I'm reaching out in a spirit of early resolution." "I'm going to stop you," Imani said. "I haven't retained my attorney for a negotiation. I've retained her to document evidence. If Mr. Seo's interests want to discuss resolution, they'll do it through Camille Rhodes at a time and a location she determines. Don't call this number again." She hung up. Malcolm was looking at her. "They moved fast." "They were already positioned," Imani said. "This wasn't improvised. They had contingency plans." She thought about it for a moment. The speed of it, the prepared attorney, the man in dark gray already working the guest list. "He knew there was a possibility I'd find out. He had a response ready." Which means he didn't think it was impossible. He thought it was unlikely. He thought the audience would hold me in place long enough. She looked at her dress. She needed to get out of the dress. The dress had been part of the architecture too, she thought. The weight of it, the visibility of it, the 100 small moments of accommodation it required. You could not run in this dress. You could not fight in it without performing fragility. "I need 20 minutes, she said. Nobody argued. She changed alone. The gown took longer to remove than to put on, which was typical of things designed to be ceremonial, easier to enter than to exit. She folded it with the same care she'd take with any expensive material and set it across the chair and put on the dark blue blazer and trousers she'd worn on the drive-in, before the morning transformed the room into something temporary. She looked better in the blazer. She felt more like herself. When she came back out, Loretta had moved from the window to the chair near the door, and Malcolm had his laptop open on the dresser, and Camille was on speakerphone, and the room had shifted from wedding morning into something that resembled the early hours of a legal crisis, which was exactly what it was. The addendum has specific formatting markers that don't match your standard document templates, Camille was saying. The font spacing on your signature line is different from the body text. That alone won't prove forgery in court, but it's a start. I need to know every document you signed in the 6 months before October. Every one, personal and corporate. I'll go through my records tonight, Imani said. I need them before tonight. I'm sending a paralegal to your home office in the next 2 hours. Imani, I need you to understand something. Camille paused in the way she paused when she was about to say something she'd already decided to say, but was giving it one more second. What you recorded is valuable, but the conversation you recorded doesn't include an explicit admission about the forgery specifically. It establishes intent. It establishes the relationship. It is not, on its own, enough to hand you everything in court. I know that, Imani said. So what it does right now is give us leverage. His people will know we have it. They'll move to discredit it. Your emotional state today, the fact that you recorded without consent in a private space. Illinois is a one-party consent state, Imani said. I know that. They know that. They'll argue the context anyway. The emotional instability narrative is already starting. I have 2 calls from journalists since your announcement. One is asking about your mental health history. Malcolm put his coffee down with more force than necessary. That's fast, he said. His PR operation started before she left the hall, Camille said. Ms. Caldwell, I want you to go somewhere private and secure tonight, and I want you to not speak to any journalist, any social contact, any extended family member, or anyone connected to Taijin's organization without me on the line. Any of them. Do you understand? Yes, Imani said. I'm also recommending we file a report about the forged document today, not Monday. Today. I want a timestamp that precedes anything his organization submits. Do it. There was a knock at the suite door. Everyone in the room stopped. Malcolm crossed to the door and opened it 2 inches without removing the security chain. A beat of silence. Then he stepped back and opened it fully. Sarah was standing in the corridor. She was still in the dress she'd worn for the ceremony. Deep charcoal silk, impeccably draped, the kind of garment that required the same level of active maintenance as the person wearing it. Her hair was still perfect, but the controlled warmth she performed in social situations was entirely gone, and what was underneath it was not the cold professionalism Imani had expected. What was underneath it looked startlingly like fear. Malcolm looked at Imani. Imani looked at Sarah. Camille, Imani said. Hold on. She stepped into the corridor and pulled the door most of the way closed behind her. Sarah looked at her without the professional warmth and without preamble. He's cutting me off. I'm sorry? The moment you made the announcement, he started distancing. His people have already been told to say I was operating independently, that the document was my initiative, not his, that he had no knowledge of the forgery. Her voice was level but tight, the way something sounds when it is being held deliberately at a controlled pitch. He's going to let me absorb it. Imani looked at her for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Because you have a recording, and I know what's on it, and so does he. If his name isn't on the forgery documentation, he needs the recording to not exist. Sarah held her gaze. He will try to get it from you, not legally. I'm telling you because if he's already sacrificing you, I become more useful than he does, Imani said. Sarah didn't deny it. That too was its own kind of answer. I have documents, Sarah said. Internal communications. Timeline of the project, what they called it internally, what the stages were, what each stage was designed to accomplish. I have 2 years of it, she paused, including the original instructions regarding your father's terminal. Imani's chest did something complicated. She kept her face from showing it. What did they call the project? She asked. Sarah told her. Project Crown. Imani stood in the corridor for a moment after Sarah said it, stood with that name sitting between them in the air, and felt the full shape of what had been designed around her. Not just the document, not just the wedding. 2 years, a structured timeline, marriage as a mechanism, loyalty as the lever, grief as the entry point. I'll have my attorney contact you, Imani said finally. Don't communicate with me directly again until she does. He'll know I spoke to you. He probably already suspects. That's your problem to manage, not mine. She held Sarah's gaze one more second. If your documents are real and your cooperation is genuine, My attorney will treat you accordingly. If you're running a second operation, she'll know within 48 hours, and I will be considerably less interested in your situation." She went back into the room and closed the door. "Camille," she said, "we need to talk about a potential cooperating witness." The call lasted another hour. By the time it ended, Camille had 3 different action items running. The forensic document specialist was already on retainer, and the initial report had been filed. Malcolm had been on a separate call with the terminal's operations manager, instructing him to flag any documentation requests or access attempts from CO-affiliated entities as of that morning. Loretta had quietly excused herself to make calls of her own. Imani did not ask to whom, and Loretta did not explain. Some of her mother's relationships were decades old and required no explanation. Downstairs, Taijin was still in the building. She knew because Malcolm had eyes on the exits. His assistant, a former Army logistics coordinator named Porter, who Malcolm trusted more than most lawyers, was monitoring the estate's parking situation. Taijin's car had not moved. Neither had 3 vehicles belonging to his organization's security detail. At 3 in the afternoon, someone slid an envelope under the bridal suite door. Malcolm picked it up before Imani could reach it. He looked at the front, which had her name written in handwriting she recognized, and held it out. "From him," Malcolm said. She opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages, handwritten, in Taijin's specific controlled script. The first page was an explanation, calm, structured, the kind of explanation built to sound like accountability while redistributing blame across multiple parties and circumstances. Sierra's overreach, a misunderstanding between legal teams. The addendum prepared without his full review. He took responsibility for not providing more oversight, which was not the same as taking responsibility for any of it. The second page was different in tone. Not an apology, an offer. He proposed a private resolution. The addendum voided. All SEO-affiliated documents connected to Caldwell Freight withdrawn. A settlement figure, a number significant enough to signal that he considered this a serious proposal, offered in exchange for the recording, the forged document, and an agreement to keep the day's events out of any legal proceeding. He signed it with his full name. Imani read it twice. Then she handed it to Malcolm, who read it, and handed it to Loretta when she came back in, who read the settlement number and said nothing. "He's scared," Malcolm said. "He's managing," Imani said. "There's a difference. He's not scared yet. He's making a calculation about whether this is cheaper to contain quietly than to litigate publicly." "Is it?" Imani looked at the letter, at the number, at the controlled handwriting that had not trembled once. "Not for me," she said. She put the letter on the dresser beside Camille's folder and picked up her phone. Outside, the late afternoon was moving toward evening over Lake Michigan, and the last of Taijin's guests were dispersing from the estate grounds. The man in dark gray had gone. The cars in the outer lot were thinning. The white roses from the ceremony hall had been moved to a staging area near the catering entrance. 40 identical arrangements waiting to be distributed or discarded, and nobody had decided which yet. Taijin's car was still there. At 4:17, he knocked on the suite door himself. Malcolm answered it this time with his full body in the frame, which was a specific kind of answer on its own. "I want 5 minutes with my—" Taijin stopped, recalibrated the noun. "With Imani." "She doesn't want 5 minutes with you," Malcolm said. "What I have to say concerns the terminal's operations. There are existing contract obligations between Caldwell Freight and 2 SEO-affiliated logistics companies that predate today. If those aren't addressed before the attorneys start pulling documents—" "Our attorneys know about them," Malcolm said. "Camille's already on it." Those contracts were structured in a way that— Something crossed Taijin's face, a very controlled version of frustration. "Malcolm, I'm trying to prevent a situation that damages both families." "There's only one family in this room that's been damaged," Malcolm said. "And you did the damage. So what you want to prevent and what we want to prevent aren't the same thing." He closed the door. The sound it made was not loud. It was final. Imani from across the room watched her brother's shoulders and said, "He's going to escalate." "I know. Not tonight. He'll wait until the story settles and then he'll escalate." She said it without heat, the way you state weather. "The offer was the first move. The next one won't be financial." Malcolm turned around. "What do you want to do?" She looked at the manila folder, at the 2 pages of Taijin's handwriting, at her phone with Camille's number still open in recent calls. Outside, a door in the lower level of the estate opened and closed, and then the sound of a car engine. Not Tae-jin's vehicle, something from the secondary lot, turning over and pulling out. "I want to go home," she said, "and I want to call the terminal's board first thing Monday. Not to explain, to chair the meeting." Malcolm looked at her. "You sure?" He built his entire plan on the assumption that I would protect what I'd built by keeping it quiet. She picked up the folder. "I'm going to protect it by making it loud." It was the first decision she'd made since morning that felt like the future rather than damage control, and it settled into her chest with a weight she recognized. The weight of something true. Something that came from the actual center of her, rather than the version of her someone else had studied and mapped and tried to use. She did not let herself feel it for long. There was too much work ahead for that. But she felt it for a moment, standing in the room where she was supposed to become someone's wife and had instead become something harder to name and considerably more difficult to contain. Then Camille called back with news that changed the shape of everything. Sarah's internal documents included a private audio recording, made by Tae-jin himself, in which he described, in his own voice with his own words, exactly how he had intended to use Imani's loyalty as the mechanism of her own dispossession. Camille read the transcript aloud over the phone, while Imani stood at the window and watched Tae-jin's car finally pull out of the estate lot below. She read it slowly, the way attorneys read things they want the other person to absorb without interruption. The recording Sarah had produced was not long, 11 minutes and 40 seconds, made on a device Tae-jin used for private memos, the kind of recording a man makes when he is thinking out loud and trusts his own security completely. The kind of recording that exists because some people believe their own operational environment is impenetrable. He had been wrong about that too. Camille read the relevant section twice. In his own voice, Tae-jin had described Imani as a structure. Not a person, a structure. A load-bearing element in a larger architecture. He had explained, in the measured tones of someone doing a competency assessment, that her primary vulnerability was not financial naivety or inexperience. He had explicitly noted she was more capable than most people in her position, but rather the specific quality of her loyalty. She committed. Once she decided something was worth protecting, she protected it past the point of self-interest. Marriage, he said, would become another structure she would protect. He said it without cruelty. That was the part Imani kept returning to. He said it with something closer to professional admiration, the way an engineer talks about a material that performs exactly as expected under load. He had studied her the way you study something you intend to use. "Imani," Camille said when she finished reading, "I'm here. I need to know you're with me on the next steps because the next 48 hours are going to move fast, and I need your decisions to be decisions, not reactions." "Tell me the steps." Camille laid them out. Sarah's cooperation would be formalized through a separate legal arrangement. Immunity from certain civil claims in exchange for authenticated documentation and testimony. The private recording would be submitted alongside the forensic analysis of the forged addendum. The CO Maritime Logistics Group would be investigated for its connection to multiple Caldwell freight transactions predating the wedding. Camille had already identified 4 contract amendments signed in the past year that bore CO organization fingerprints, not forgeries, but language that had been introduced into legitimate negotiations in ways that systematically shifted operational authority in directions Imani had not understood at the time of signing. He was already inside the terminal, Imani said. Not operationally, not yet, but the framework was being constructed. Today was the closing mechanism. Camille paused. The wedding was not the beginning, Imani. It was the end of a 2-year process. 2 years. Imani set her phone face down on the dresser and pressed both palms flat against the surface and breathed. The room was quiet. Malcolm had stepped out to call Porter. Loretta was in the bathroom running water for no apparent reason, which was what Loretta did when she needed to be somewhere that required nothing of her for 5 minutes. 2 years ago was 6 months before she'd met him. She picked the phone back up. Were there people inside the terminal helping him? A silence that lasted exactly 1 beat too long. Camille. We don't know yet. The contract amendments went through your operations director's office. That doesn't mean he participated knowingly. The language changes were subtle enough that a careful reading was required to catch them. but we need to examine that. The operations director was a man named Gerald Okafor. He had worked for Raymond Caldwell for 11 years. He had given a eulogy at her father's funeral that made Malcolm cry, which almost nothing managed to do. He had brought Amani coffee on her first day in the boardroom and told her that her father had talked about her every week. "I want the audit expanded," Amani said. "Every document that passed through Gerald's office in the past 2 years. Every one. I'll make the call tonight." She hung up and stood alone in the room for a moment. Then she sat down in the chair by the window because her legs had decided they were finished standing, and she let the information settle into her the way you let cold water settle when you've swallowed it wrong, carefully, deliberately, waiting for the body to adjust. She had thought the damage was the wedding. She had thought the wedding was the attack, and she had stopped it, and now the damage was contained. She had been looking at the last page. The whole time she had been reading the last page of something much longer. Malcolm came back in and read her face immediately. What happened? She told him about the contract amendments. She told him about Gerald's office. She watched Malcolm's expression do the thing it did when he was recalibrating. The jaw tightening, the slight forward shift of weight, the specific stillness of a man reorganizing everything he thought he understood. He sat down across from her. "How much does he have?" Malcolm asked. "Enough to have made today possible," Amani said. "How much more depends on what the audit finds. If Gerald was involved, I don't know that he was. But if he was," Amani looked at her brother, "then we deal with that. Dad trusted him. Dad trusted a lot of people he shouldn't have and fewer people than he should have. He wasn't perfect at reading people either." She said it quietly, without judgment. It was just true. Neither are we. Monday came fast and brutal. She had spent Sunday at her home in Lincoln Park, in the specific productive numbness that follows a crisis when the adrenaline has metabolized and the work remains. Camille's paralegal had arrived and left with 4 boxes of documents. The terminal's security team had been instructed to log all access attempts, requests, and communications from any CO-affiliated entity. Amani had read the internal communications Sarah had provided. 87 pages of message threads, internal memos, and operational planning documents. And by 2 in the morning, she had a clear enough picture of Project Crown's architecture that she could have drawn it on a whiteboard. It was, she had to admit, impressive in the worst possible way. Stage 1 had been relationship establishment. 18 months before she met him, Taijin's people had begun mapping the Caldwell freight operation, identifying vulnerabilities, understanding the trust structure, locating the emotional geography of the family, who made decisions, who influenced decisions, who could be leveraged. Stage 2 had been contact and cultivation. The logistics conference had not been accidental. The mutual contact who introduced them, a man named Philip Starr, a freight consultant Imani had worked with twice, had been in Taijin's financial network for 3 years. The introduction had been engineered. Stage 3 was relationship deepening, concurrent with legal infiltration. While Imani fell in love, CO-affiliated attorneys and consultants had been quietly introduced into Caldwell Freight's vendor relationships, contract negotiations, and operational planning committees. The language amendments began in month 4 of the relationship. Stage 4 was marriage and formalization. The forged addendum. The post-ceremony signing window. Imani's anticipated emotional state. The 200-person audience designed to prevent interruption. She had stopped it at stage 4. But stages 1 through 3 had already happened. The relationship was real to her. The infiltration was real in her company's records. The consultant who introduced them had been paid for access. And somewhere in the document trail, there was a man who had brought her coffee on her first boardroom morning and may or may not have been allowing paperwork to pass through his office in directions Raymond Caldwell would never have permitted. The Monday board meeting started at 9. Imani arrived at Caldwell Freight Terminal at 7:45, which was 45 minutes before anyone expected her, which was the point. She walked the dock floor in a charcoal blazer and flat shoes while the morning shift was loading, and the workers who recognized her nodded or raised a hand and she nodded back and kept moving. She had done this with her father when she was 12, walked the dock before the administrative day started, when the operation was purely physical, when it was just the weight of things being moved by people who knew how to move them. Raymond Caldwell had called it keeping honest. She sat in his chair at 9:05 and looked at the 7 board members around the table and said, without preamble. You've seen the news. I'm not going to address the personal dimensions of Saturday. What I'm going to address is the operational reality, which is that an external party has had unauthorized influence on at least 4 contract amendments executed in this room over the past 18 months. We are conducting a full forensic audit beginning today. Effective immediately, no contract, amendment, addendum, or operational agreement moves forward without dual authorization from 2 board members and independent legal review. Any existing agreement bearing language introduced by CO-affiliated consultants is frozen pending review. The table was quiet. Gerald Okafor was in the 3rd seat on the left. He was 62, heavy-set, with the particular stillness of a man who had sat in enough difficult meetings to know when one had become something different than what it appeared. He was very still right now. "Imani," said board member Patricia Chu, the longest-serving member aside from Gerald. "The scope of what you're describing, I know the scope," Imani said. "So does our legal team. The audit begins today. I need full cooperation from every department head, and I need document access logs from the past 24 months. If anyone in this room has concerns about what that audit will find, I'm asking you to speak to Camille Rhodes directly before the end of business today." She looked around the table. Not to me, to her. She held Gerald's gaze for 1 second on her way back to the door. He didn't look away. She had not decided yet what that meant. Camille called at 11 with the first audit results from the document forensics team. Imani was in her father's office. Her office now. She was still adjusting to the grammar of that, with the door closed and the lake visible through the window behind the desk, flat and gray under a sky that hadn't decided what it wanted to do. "The 4 contract amendments we identified are the visible layer," Camille said. "There are 2 more. 6 total. The language pattern is consistent. Each amendment introduced provisions that created a pathway for external management authority to be invoked under specific operational conditions. None of them would trigger independently. Together, in the correct sequence, they would have allowed a CO-affiliated entity to assert operational co-management of the terminal's 3 largest shipping contracts within 60 days of the marriage. 60 days. "By the time I understood what was happening," Imani said, "by the time any attorney not specifically looking for this pattern would have identified it." Camille's voice had the controlled, even quality of someone managing their own reaction in real time. "This is sophisticated, Imani. This was designed by someone who understood logistics law specifically and Caldwell Freight's contract structure specifically. This wasn't a generalist operation." "Someone with access," Imani said. "Someone with detailed access. Floor-level operational knowledge, contract history, the kind of information you develop from years inside a company, not from external consultation." The sentence ended and sat in the air between them. Imani looked at the lake. "Gerald," she said, "I don't want to say that without evidence. But that's where the access points." Camille was quiet for 3 seconds. "The document trail passes through his office at every stage. That's what the logs show. Whether he understood what he was passing, whether it was negligence or participation, we don't have that yet." "How long to get it?" 48 hours if he cooperates. Longer if he doesn't." Imani leaned back in her father's chair and pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, because there was a physical sensation there. Not quite pain, not quite pressure. Something that felt like what grief would feel like if grief were also fury. Gerald Okafor had stood at her father's funeral and cried. Or had appeared to cry. "I want to talk to him myself," she said, "before the investigators." "Imani, that's not... I know it's not standard procedure. I'm asking." A pause. "If he lawyers up afterward, anything he says to you becomes complicated. I'll take that risk. That's not just your risk, it affects the case." "Camille." She kept her voice level. "He worked with my father for 11 years. If he's going to tell me something, he's going to tell me in a room with me, not in a room with investigators he's never met. And if he's not going to tell me anything, then we'll know that too." A long pause. 45 minutes, before the investigators arrive. "I want a record of the conversation." "Fine." She found Gerald in his office on the 2nd floor, where he'd been since the board meeting. He hadn't left for lunch. His assistant told Imani he'd sent everyone else out at 10:30 and hadn't asked for anything since. She knocked twice and opened the door without waiting. Gerald was at his desk with his hands flat on the surface in front of him and nothing else. No files open, no computer active, no phone visible. He looked like a man who had been sitting exactly like that for a while. He looked up when she came in. His face did not perform surprise. "Close the door," he said. She did. She sat in the chair across from his desk, the chair she'd sat in a dozen times, asking questions about operations, learning the rhythm of the company from the man her father had trusted most. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "He approached me 2 years ago," Gerald said. "Before you met him." The words landed without drama. No preamble, no explanation, no defensive positioning, just the fact, dropped into the room like something he'd been holding for a long time and had finally set down. Imani did not move. "He came to me through a freight industry contact, a man I'd worked with for years who I had no reason to distrust. He said he was interested in a strategic partnership with Caldwell Freight, long-term investment. He said Raymond would have been interested." Gerald's voice caught slightly on the name and then continued. "He was very informed about the terminal. He knew things, operational things, financial things, that I hadn't published anywhere." "He'd already been doing research," Imani said. "Yes, I understand that now." Gerald looked at his hands. "He asked me to provide him with operational assessments. Nothing classified, nothing that didn't exist in our standard reports. He said it was for investor due diligence. He paid me for the assessments." "How much?" Gerald told her. It was not a catastrophic number. It was not life-changing money. It was the amount a man accepts when he is not thinking of it as a betrayal but as a consultation. When he is telling himself it is information that would be available anyway to any serious investor. "The contract language," Imani said. Gerald closed his eyes for a moment. He introduced an attorney, said she was a freight specialist. She knew the industry. She proposed language adjustments that she said would make the contracts more competitive for international bidders. I reviewed them. They seemed reasonable. He opened his eyes. "I did not understand what they would do in combination. I want you to know that." "I do know that, Gerald." She kept her voice even. "And I also know that you stopped questioning it somewhere along the way because you'd already accepted his money, and it was easier to believe the attorney than to pull everything back and look at the full picture." He said nothing. "You knew what his name was. You knew who he was before I met him." Gerald's jaw moved. "I became concerned when the relationship between you two became public. I told myself—" He stopped, started again. "I told myself that if it was legitimate, there was no harm, that a partnership between the families—" "Stop!" Imani's voice came out harder than she'd intended, and she did not soften it. "Don't tell me what you told yourself. Tell me if there's anything else." He told her about a meeting in November, 4 months before the engagement. Taejin had come to Gerald directly, not through the attorney, not through the freight contact, and told him that the timeline was accelerating, that Gerald's continued cooperation was expected, that the information Gerald had already provided created a relationship of mutual interest that it would be inadvisable to walk back from. He had not used the word threat. He hadn't needed to. "He told me what would happen to my family," Gerald said. "My son works in city logistics. My daughter-in-law is a municipal contract manager. He didn't threaten them explicitly. He simply described their situations very accurately and then changed the subject." Imani sat with that. She had known, intellectually, that Taejin's operation existed beneath the legitimate surface. She had known it in the abstract, the way you know a river is deep even when the water looks calm. But knowing it abstractly and sitting across from Gerald Okafor, Gerald, who had been with her father since the second warehouse, who had driven Raymond to the hospital the first time his heart gave them a warning, and hearing him describe being quietly threatened into continued cooperation was something different. It was the thing Taejin had designed around her, the thing he'd studied and mapped and converted into strategy. He hadn't just targeted Imani, he had moved through everyone around her: Gerald, Philip Starr, the freight attorney, the document chain, the investor relationships. He had built a perimeter around Caldwell Freight using the people her family trusted, and then he had walked toward the center, and the center was her, and the mechanism he'd used for the center was love. "I need your complete written account of every interaction," Imani said. "Every payment, every communication, every meeting. I need it before 4 o'clock today, and I need you to give it to Camille Rhodes personally." Imani, I'm not deciding anything about your position today. That decision will be made after the legal process has a shape. She stood up. But I need you to understand that the man who threatened your family is now facing the consequences of what he did to mine. And the only path through this for everyone is complete disclosure. If you protect anything, Isol, it will come out in the audit and it will look like you chose him over my father's company. Do you understand? Gerald looked at her across the desk. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for 2 years and had just been told he could put it down. But that setting it down was going to cost him something he wasn't sure he could afford. Yes, he said. She left his office and stood in the hallway for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes on the ceiling and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth 4 times, slowly. Then Camille called. The forensic specialist finished the signature analysis, Camille said. It's confirmed. The signature on the addendum was digitally extracted from the scholarship document, the Raymond Caldwell Memorial Scholarship Fund application you signed in October. The extraction method is sophisticated enough that it required a specialized tool. This isn't someone scanning a document and tracing. Whoever did this had access to professional forgery technology. Imani absorbed that. The scholarship document, she said. Yes. Her father's name. His memorial. The thing Malcolm had organized with his own hands because he needed to do something with the grief that didn't just sit in a room and breathe. They had used that. Tajin's people had taken the document that existed because Raymond Caldwell was dead and his family loved him and wanted to build something in his name, and they had used it as the raw material for stealing his daughter's signature to transfer his terminal. The fury that moved through Imani's body was not hot. It was cold in the specific way that cold things are more dangerous than hot things because they don't dissipate. They hold their temperature, they wait, they remain functional at extremes. File everything, she said. The signature analysis, Gerald's disclosure, Sarah's documents, the recording. File all of it today. We're not quite ready for full filing. The attorney review on Sarah's material won't be, how long? 36 hours if I push everyone. Push everyone. She paused. And Camille, I want the forensic audit expanded again. I want to know every transaction, every communication, every document that touched Caldwell Freight with any SEO fingerprint on it, going back 3 years. Not 2. 3. That's a significant scope increase. I know. She looked down the hallway toward the staircase. He spent 2 years building this. I want to know every brick. She was halfway down the stairs when her phone showed a notification from a number she didn't recognize. A text, not a call, with a Chicago area code that resolved when she searched it to a communications firm she'd never heard of. The text contained a link to a news article that had posted 12 minutes earlier. The headline described Imani Caldwell as emotionally volatile, citing anonymous sources close to the SEO family. The article quoted a psychiatrist, not identified, not connected to Imani, discussing the psychological profile of women who make impulsive decisions under financial pressure. It referenced her father's death and suggested unresolved grief as a contributing factor. She stood on the staircase and read it twice. Her hands were steady. Then she forwarded it to Camille with 3 words: track the funding. She kept walking down the stairs because the dock floor was below her and the terminal was running, and 23 workers on the morning shift were moving freight in and out of a facility that her father had built from nothing, and that a man who studied her like a blueprint had spent 2 years trying to acquire. And the work did not stop because the crisis was large. The work was how you proved you were still standing. She reached the dock floor, and the smell hit her, diesel and lake air, and the particular metallic cold of the loading bay in the morning. And she stood there for a moment in it, and for the first time since Saturday, she felt something that was not strategy, not control, not the managed forward motion of crisis management. She felt how tired she was. Not tired enough to stop, just tired enough to know that the cost of the next weeks was going to be real and physical and would need to be paid by a person who had not slept more than 4 hours in the past 2 nights and who had just learned that the man she'd loved had recruited her father's closest colleague and used her father's memorial to steal her name. She gave herself 30 seconds of it. Then she went back upstairs because Camille's investigator had just arrived with a hard drive containing Sierra's complete document cache, and somewhere in those documents was the financial trail that connected Tajin's payments to Gerald's account. And once that connection was documented and authenticated, the full shape of Project Crown would be visible in ways that no attorney and no PR operation and no settlement offer would be able to contain. She sat down at her father's desk and opened the first file and began to read. And outside the window, the lake was still gray and still flat and still enormous, the way it always was. Indifferent to everything that happened on its shore, holding nothing and giving nothing back. The hard drive contained 412 files. Imani worked through them in order, which was not how Sarah had organized them. Sarah had organized them by date, but date order told you what happened when, and Imani needed to understand what happened why. She reorganized by category: financial transfers, internal communications, legal drafts, operational assessments, and a fifth folder she created herself and labeled simply Gerald, because his name appeared in enough documents to warrant its own architecture. She worked for 6 hours without leaving the office. Her assistant brought food at 2 in the afternoon that she ate without tasting. Malcolm came in at 3:30 and sat in the chair across the desk and read files on his own laptop in silence, which was the most useful thing anyone had done for her since Saturday. He didn't ask how she was. Malcolm had understood since childhood that asking Imani how she was during a crisis was like asking someone swimming a river how they felt about the water. The question had no useful answer and cost everyone time. At 4:17, Gerald's written account arrived via Camille's secure upload system. 31 pages, handwritten and then scanned, with 11 attachments consisting of emails, transfer confirmations, and a single voicemail transcript that Gerald had apparently kept because some part of him had understood, even in November, that he might need it. The voicemail was from Tai Jin, not delivered through an intermediary, not filtered through an attorney or a consultant. Tai Jin's own voice, personal and direct, left on a Tuesday evening when Gerald had apparently missed a check-in call. The transcription read, "Gerald, you've been reliable. I want that to continue. The next stage requires the amendments to clear by end of month. I know you understand what continuation of our arrangement means for your family's situation. Call me back." Imani read it once. Then she photographed it with her phone and sent it to Camille with the message, "This is the direct link. This puts his voice on the coercion." Camille responded in 4 minutes. "This changes the filing significantly. Give me tonight." By the time Imani left the terminal at 8:30, the shape of what they had was clear enough to be frightening in its completeness. 6 corrupted contract amendments, 31 pages of Gerald's disclosure, 87 pages of Sarah's documentation, the private recording of Tai Jin describing Imani as a structure, the voicemail, the forensic signature analysis, the financial transfer records connecting Tai Jin's organization to Gerald's private account across 11 payments over 22 months, and Imani's own recording from the corridor on Saturday morning. It was enough. She knew it was enough the same way she knew when a doc manifest was correct. Not because every number was individually verified, but because the weight of the thing corresponded to the reality of the thing. And when those two aligned, you were looking at truth. She went home and slept for 5 hours. It was the most she would sleep for the next 2 weeks. The filing hit on Wednesday morning. Camille's office submitted the complete package to the relevant authorities at 9 a.m. Civil fraud claim, forgery documentation, evidence of financial coercion, the forensic signature analysis, and a formal request for investigation into the CO Meriton Logistics Group's contract relationships with Caldwell Freight. By noon, 3 journalists who covered the financial and legal beat had the broad outlines of the story from sources Camille had selected and briefed precisely. Not Imani herself, not Malcolm, not anyone inside the family, but 2 attorneys and a forensic accountant who could speak to the documentary evidence without editorializing about the personal dimensions. By 3 in the afternoon, the story was running. It was not the story Tai Jin's organization had been building, the one about Imani's instability, her grief, her impulsive decision on a wedding morning. The story that ran was about Project Crown, about a 2-year operation, about a forged signature on a freight document, about a man whose name appeared on a voicemail telling a 62-year-old company veteran that his family's welfare depended on his continued cooperation. Imani watched the coverage from the terminal's second-floor conference room with Malcolm and Camille on a laptop screen and did not feel the satisfaction she'd anticipated. She felt the dull recognition of forward motion, the sense of a thing moving in the right direction, not because the direction was painless, but because it was correct. Tai Jin's response came at 4:30. It came through Warren Chu, the attorney who had called her on Saturday. This time he called Camille, not Imani, which meant someone had given him adequate instruction in how to proceed. The call lasted 14 minutes. When it ended, Camille called Imani. "He's offering a full settlement," Camille said. "Withdrawal of all SEO-affiliated contract claims, complete voiding of the addendum, financial restitution for legal fees and documented damages, and a non-disparagement agreement on both sides." "No," Imani said. "Let me finish. He's also offering to provide documentation regarding 2 other operations his organization has run against freight and logistics companies in the past 4 years. Names, transaction records, methodologies. He's essentially offering to be an informant on his own industry in exchange for a civil resolution that keeps him out of a criminal referral." Imani stood at the conference room window and looked at the dock below. A forklift was moving a pallet of freight toward the east loading bay. 2 workers in high-visibility vests were talking near the bay door. Normal operational life continuing in the building her father had made. "What does Camille think?" Malcolm asked from behind her. She looked at her phone. "I'm asking Camille now." She put it on speaker. "Strategically," Camille said, "the settlement ends the civil process faster and with certainty. The information he's offering has value to authorities investigating similar operations. There is a reasonable argument that taking this deal causes the most systemic good in the shortest time." "And," Imani said, "and it means he does not face a public proceeding. It means the full extent of Project Crown does not become part of a public record. It means Gerald's cooperation, Sarah's documentation, the voicemail, the recording, none of it is tested in an open process. In 3 years, the narrative about Saturday will have 2 competing versions, and money will have made his version viable again." "So he rebuilds," Imani said. "Possibly. Probably, with his resources." She thought about the news article she'd forwarded to Camille on Monday, the one quoting an unnamed psychiatrist about women who made impulsive decisions under financial pressure. She thought about the speed of it, the precision of it, the way it had appeared within 12 minutes of the coverage beginning and had already been constructed with the specific vocabulary designed to undermine her credibility before she'd filed anything. She thought about a man who had spent 2 years studying what she loved and converting it into a mechanism. "Tell Warren Chu that we are not interested in a settlement," Imani said. "Tell him that every document currently in our possession will be filed in full and made available to every relevant authority, and that if his client has information about other operations, he is welcome to provide that information to investigators directly as part of a separate process that has nothing to do with the Caldwell claim." Camille was quiet for a moment. "You understand this gets harder from here." "I know." "He's going to use everything available to him. The PR operation escalates. His attorneys will challenge the recording's admissibility. They'll depose Gerald extensively, and they'll try to make his involvement look like a bilateral scheme rather than coercion. Sarah's credibility will be attacked. This becomes a public fight that lasts months, possibly over a year." "I know," Imani said again. "Okay," Camille said. "Then let's fight." The next 6 weeks were the most relentless period of Imani's adult life, and she had managed her father's terminal through a market contraction and a labor dispute in the same calendar year, so her baseline for relentless was not low. Tajin's attorneys filed 3 separate motions challenging the admissibility of the corridor recording within the first 10 days, each on different legal grounds, each requiring Camille's team to respond with specificity and documentation. The recording was ultimately admitted. The motions had not been designed to win. They'd been designed to consume time and resources and generate enough procedural noise that the story became about legal technicalities rather than a forged signature on a freight document. The PR operation intensified the week after the filing. A podcast episode appeared, not a news program, a true crime-adjacent podcast with a substantial audience, that dedicated 40 minutes to a sympathetic portrait of Tajin as a man targeted by a scorned woman, weaponizing her family's legal resources after a broken engagement. The episode's host had clearly been briefed with specific details that could only have come from someone close to the situation. Imani's past relationships were mentioned. Her father's death was described as a destabilizing event that had affected her judgment. The scholarship fund was mentioned as evidence of her emotional volatility in business decisions. The scholarship fund. Malcolm listened to 4 minutes of it before he left the room. Imani listened to all 40 minutes. She took notes. The following week, a detailed rebuttal was published by a financial journalist who had been given exclusive access to the full documentary record: the contract amendments, the forensic analysis, the payment history, a portion of Gerald's account. The article ran 6,000 words and included a timeline of Project Crown laid out with enough specificity that any reader with a baseline understanding of logistics contracts could follow the mechanism. It was read 200,000 times in the first 48 hours. Tae-jin's legitimate investors started calling his attorneys the morning after it published. Imani knew this because Sarah, operating now under Camille's arrangement, was still receiving some internal communications from Tae-jin's organization. Communications his people had not yet locked her out of, because the lockout was still in process and bureaucratic systems, even criminal ones, run on lag time. Sarah forwarded 6 emails that documented the investor panic with the specific controlled urgency of people who had placed money in a legitimate enterprise and were now watching the legitimate enterprise discover. It had been built on something considerably less legitimate than advertised. 3 of Tae-jin's major business partners withdrew from joint ventures in the same week. A 4th sent a letter through attorneys that characterized the withdrawal as routine portfolio restructuring, which convinced no one but preserved everyone's ability to claim ignorance later. Tae-jin's response to all of this was to go quiet. Imani had expected escalation, more legal motions, more media operations, possibly direct pressure on Caldwell Freight's vendor relationships. What she got instead was silence, and silence from Tae-jin was more unsettling than noise because she understood by now that silence was where he did his most careful work. She told Malcolm. Malcolm told Porter. Porter quietly arranged for enhanced security at the terminal's administrative offices and at Imani's home, framed as a routine operational review, without discussion of what specifically was being secured against. On a Thursday evening in the 5th week, Imani was alone in the terminal's 2nd-floor office when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside that were not any of the 3 people who should have been in the building at that hour. She did not move from the desk. The door opened. Tae-jin walked in. He was alone, or appeared to be alone, which with Tae-jin was never the same thing. He was in a dark jacket and no tie, which was the most casual she had ever seen him outside of private situations, and his face had the constructed calm she had learned to read as performance rather than state. But underneath the construction tonight there was something else, something that sat differently in the set of his jaw and the way he was holding his shoulders slightly forward, not with aggression but with the specific body language of someone who has spent several weeks absorbing things they did not expect to absorb. He looked tired. She had not expected that. She did not stand up. "You should not be in this building," she said. "I know." He looked around the office, at the stacked document boxes, the whiteboards with audit timelines, her father's photograph still on the wall behind the desk. "I came without attorneys." "That's inadvisable." "Yes." He remained near the door. He did not come closer, which she noted. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm not here to offer anything." "Then why are you here?" He looked at her across the width of her father's office and said nothing for a moment. The building made its ambient sounds. The dock below them, a distant forklift, the specific resonance of a large structure settling in the evening cold. "Because I wanted to say something to you directly," he said. "Not through attorneys, not in a filing." "I'm recording this conversation," she said. This time it was true. Her phone was running in her jacket pocket, had been running since the footsteps. Something crossed his face. Not surprise, closer to the acknowledgement of something expected. "I know you probably are." He paused. "What I'm going to say? I don't mind being recorded." She waited. "I understood you," he said. "I want you to know that. Not as a strategy. I mean, before the strategy existed, when I was first learning who you were, I understood what kind of person you were. I recognized it." He stopped. Started again in a different register, slightly less constructed. "That's not an excuse. I'm aware it makes it worse." "It makes it worse," she confirmed. "I know." His jaw moved. "The terminal, your father's work, what it meant to you. I understood that too. And I told myself that what I was doing was not incompatible with that a Caldwell CO operation would have been something your father might have." He stopped himself. "That's the version I was using. I'm aware it was the version that served the plan." Imani looked at him. Her hands were on the desk, flat, still. Her heartbeat was steady, which surprised her, but perhaps it shouldn't have. She had been preparing for this conversation in some form since Saturday morning, even before she'd known it would happen. "Why are you here, Taejin?" she said. Not a question, a demand. He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd come in. "Because the people around me are telling me to keep fighting. My attorneys, my organization, they're telling me we can outlast this. That your legal team will exhaust itself. That Gerald's testimony can be discredited. That Sarah's cooperation can be framed as self-interested fabrication." He paused. "And I needed to stand in this room and see whether that was something I could actually do." The room was quiet. "And?" Imani said. He looked at the photograph of Raymond Caldwell on the wall behind her. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked back at her, and she could see in his face the things she had occasionally glimpsed in 14 months, and had always interpreted as depth, and now understood was the oldest version of him. The part that existed before the calculation, before the architecture, before the strategy that had converted her grief into a key. "No," he said. "I don't think I can do it." She looked at him. "I'm going to instruct Warren Chu to contact your attorney tomorrow morning," he said. "Not a settlement. A full cooperation agreement with the relevant authorities. Full disclosure of Project Crown. Every stage. Every participant. Gerald's role, Thera's role, the consultants, the attorneys, the document chain." He paused. "My role." The silence that followed was the longest of the evening. "Why are you telling me this tonight?" Imani said. "You could have instructed Chu in the morning without coming here." He didn't answer right away. When he did, it was with the specific honesty of a man who has stopped managing the impression he's making. "Because I wanted you to hear it from me first, not from a filing, not from an attorney." He looked at the desk, at her hands flat on the surface, at the document boxes, at all of it. "You deserved at least that." He left the same way he'd come in. She heard his footsteps down the corridor, the staircase, the exterior door. She sat alone in the office for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Then she called Camille. She told her what had happened, what had been said, what he'd indicated he would do. Camille listened without interrupting, which was unusual. Camille Rhodes interrupted constantly during normal information delivery because she was processing faster than most people spoke. The fact that she was silent meant she was absorbing something that required more processing than usual. "If he follows through," Camille said when Imani finished, "if the cooperation agreement is genuine and the disclosure is full, Imani, this ends the civil process. This ends it completely and decisively. A full cooperation disclosure from Taejin himself supersedes everything we've built. It becomes the definitive record." "I know." "It also means, depending on the scope of the disclosure, that his organization faces exposure well beyond the Caldwell claim. This isn't just about your terminal anymore. If Project Crown was a methodology used on multiple targets—" "He mentioned other operations," Imani said. "In the settlement offer, he offered to provide information about other companies." "He's going to give them everything," Camille said. It wasn't a question. "He's calculated that full cooperation is the only play that preserves anything." "I think so." Or, Camille stopped. Or he's doing it for a reason that isn't entirely strategic." A pause. "People occasionally do things for more than one reason simultaneously, Imani." Imani looked at the window. The dock was dark now, the evening shift winding down, the bay lights throwing long rectangles across the concrete below. "Get everything ready for tomorrow," she said. "Whatever he files, I want us positioned to respond within the hour." She ended the call and sat in the dark office and did not let herself think about the look on his face when he'd seen Raymond Caldwell's photograph on the wall. She did not let herself think about it for a long time. The cooperation agreement was filed the following morning at 10:45. It was 63 pages. It was the most complete voluntary disclosure of a systematic financial fraud operation that Camille's investigators had seen in 12 years of practice. And Camille told Imani that over the phone in a voice that had lost its attorney's measured quality and had become briefly, simply, the voice of someone who was stunned. Every stage of Project Crown, every participant, every payment, every communication, the methodology, the relationship cultivation, the legal infiltration, the document preparation, the signature forgery operation, the timeline, the contingency planning for discovery. Two additional companies that had been targeted by similar operations, one of which had not discovered the compromise and was still operating under contract conditions that gave CO-affiliated entities latent authority over significant operational decisions. And a section at the end, written in Taijin's own voice rather than legal language, that the attorneys had apparently tried to remove and he had apparently insisted on keeping. Camille read it to Amani over the phone. It said, "The architecture described in this disclosure was designed around a specific individual's loyalty, grief, and capacity for commitment. Those qualities are not weaknesses. The failure of this operation was not attributable to any intelligence failure on my part. The operation failed because the individual it was designed around was more completely herself than I had accounted for. I did not misread her. I underestimated what it means to be entirely who you are when the pressure is designed to make you someone else." Amani sat with that. Outside the office window, the lake was doing something unusual. The surface had gone almost completely still in the morning calm, flat as a table, reflecting a sky that had finally decided to be clear. It looked like something her father would have commented on. Raymond had kept a weather log for 20 years because he believed in paying attention to what the environment was doing around you, on the grounds that ignoring it didn't change it, and understanding it gave you at least the dignity of being a prepared participant in whatever came next. She had inherited the habit. She was looking at the lake when her phone showed a call from a number she recognized as belonging to a federal investigator who had requested a preliminary conversation about the Caldwell claim 2 weeks earlier, and whose interest in the case, she now understood, had probably always been about considerably more than one forged signature on one freight document. She picked up. The investigator's name was Torres. He spoke with the economy of someone who charged his time carefully and had learned not to spend more words than a situation required. "Ms. Caldwell," he said, "I've reviewed this morning's filing. I'd like to meet with you and your attorney at your earliest convenience. What Mr. CO has provided significantly broadens the investigation's scope, and your documentary record, specifically the Gerald Okafor disclosure and the forensic analysis, closes several evidentiary gaps we've been working around." A pause. "I also want you to know, for your own information, that what you did in the weeks following Saturday, the decisions you made, the speed of the documentation, the scope of the audit you authorized, made this outcome possible. A different response from you, and we'd be looking at a much more limited picture." She almost said something about her father. She stopped herself. "What time works for your office?" she said. Torres named a time. She confirmed it. He ended the call. She sat alone with the lake for another moment. Then the door opened and Malcolm came in with 2 cups of coffee. The right place this time, the place near the terminal's east entrance that Raymond had used for 20 years, and set one in front of her and looked at the window and said, "Clear today." "Yes," she said. He sat down across the desk and picked up his cup and looked at her over the rim with the expression he'd had since they were children, when something had shifted and he was waiting to see if she knew it too. "We won," he said. It wasn't celebratory. It was the statement of a fact that had arrived with a weight neither of them had entirely expected. Amani looked at her coffee, at her father's photograph, at the boxes of documents that represented 2 years of a man's architecture and 4 weeks of her own. "We won the case," she said. Malcolm looked at her. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. They sat together in the morning light, with the lake flat and clear beyond the window and the terminal running below them, and the day's work waiting, the way it always waited, indifferent to what had just ended and entirely committed to what came next. The formal proceedings against Taijin began 6 weeks later. By then, Amani had already started 3 things that would matter more to her in the years ahead than any courtroom outcome. The forensic audit's findings had been converted into a permanent dual authorization protocol for all Caldwell freight contracts, a change that required a board vote she called and won with 6 of 7 members, Gerald abstaining and subsequently resigning with a letter she read once and did not discuss publicly. The Raymond Caldwell Memorial Scholarship Fund had been redocumented with new signatures on new paperwork with a new notarization that existed entirely separately from anything that had ever touched Taijin's organization. And Amani had hired a structural engineer to assess the feasibility of converting an abandoned Caldwell warehouse on the city's south side into a training facility for young logistics professionals. The engineer arrived on a Tuesday morning with a site assessment kit and a directness about load-bearing walls that she found unexpectedly refreshing. His name was Darius Monroe. He told her the drainage situation on the south side of the building was a serious problem that her original assessment had significantly underestimated, and that whoever had done the initial survey had either been working from outdated site data or had not actually walked the floor, and that correcting it would add 6 weeks and a non-trivial budget adjustment to the project timeline. She told him she preferred to know the truth of a problem at the beginning rather than discover it expensively in the middle. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating a first impression and said that was exactly the right way to think about structural work and also about most other things. She almost smiled. She did not, quite. There was too much still sitting in her chest for smiling to come easily, too much of the past week still present in the way she held her shoulders and assessed every room she entered. But she came close, which was more than she'd managed since a Saturday morning above Lake Michigan, when the future she'd planned had been replaced by the future she would have to make. Darius Monroe wrote his drainage assessment on a Tuesday and submitted it Thursday, and was entirely correct about the 6 weeks, and the project moved forward with the timeline adjusted to account for reality rather than preference, the way all solid things are built. Imani walked the warehouse floor on the morning the first correction work began, in flat shoes and a dark jacket, and stood in the middle of the empty space and listened to the sounds of the building being made more honest than it had been before. Outside, the city ran. Inside, the work began. She stayed until the afternoon, asking questions and receiving direct answers, and by the time she left, she knew the drainage problem, the load tolerance of the east wall, and the name of every worker on the site. She wrote them in the margin of her notebook beside the drainage numbers, the way her father had taught her, because knowing what a thing weighed and knowing who was carrying it were never two separate pieces of information. They were always the same fact, seen from different angles. The federal courtroom on the 14th floor smelled like recycled air and old carpet, and the specific exhaustion of a building that had absorbed decades of people bringing their worst problems into its rooms and leaving without all of them resolved. Imani arrived 20 minutes early. She had not planned to be early. She had planned to arrive at the precise time Camille specified, professional, controlled, neither eager nor delayed. But she'd woken at 4:30 in the morning with the specific full-body alertness of someone whose nervous system had decided that sleep was finished and the day was beginning regardless of the alarm, and she'd been ready by 7 and in the car by 8 and standing outside the building at 8:40 with 40 minutes to fill before she needed to be anywhere. She walked a block in each direction. The city was doing what it did at that hour on a Thursday in late October. Moving, purposeful, indifferent to the particular weight any individual was carrying through it. A delivery driver double-parked on the corner. A woman in scrubs walked with the specific forward lean of someone at the end rather than the beginning of a shift. 2 men in construction gear stood outside a coffee cart debating something with the economy of people who had the same argument regularly enough to have shortened it. Imani watched them and felt the city's indifference as something close to comfort. The city did not care what happened in the courtroom today. It would continue regardless. That was not a cold thought. It was a stabilizing one. Some things were larger than outcomes, and the fact of their continuation meant the outcome, whatever it was, would be absorbed and survived and eventually become part of the background rather than the foreground. Her father had said something like that once. Not in those words. Raymond Caldwell expressed himself in the concrete, not the philosophical, but the sense of it had come through. She had been 17 and a junior varsity soccer season had ended badly, and she had asked him how you kept going after something fell apart. He had looked at the lake, they were at the terminal where he always took her when something needed space around it, and said, "The freight still moves. That's not cold. That's just true. Things keep moving and you keep moving with them." She had not understood it at 17. She understood it now. Camille found her on the sidewalk at 9:05 and they went in together. The courtroom filled the way courtrooms fill when a case has attracted the specific gravity of documented institutional fraud. Not with chaos, but with the careful density of people who had chosen their seats for reasons. Journalists in the press section with the particular alert stillness of professionals who had learned not to telegraph interest. Tajin's remaining business associates in the gallery rows behind the defense, wearing the expensive, careful blankness of men assessing risk in real time. Two federal investigators in the back row who Amani recognized from Torres's team, not here as witnesses, here as collectors, absorbing the public record of a proceeding that fed their larger one. Sarah was not present. Her arrangement had been formalized through Camille's office 3 weeks prior. Immunity from civil claims in exchange for authenticated documentation and live testimony, should it be required. The testimony had not been required. The 63 pages of Taijin's own disclosure had made Sarah's testimony redundant in the evidentiary sense, and the arrangement permitted her absence from proceedings where her presence was not legally necessary. She was somewhere in the city, managing the specific condition of a person who had cooperated her way out of one danger and into a future she hadn't yet found the shape of. Amani did not feel simple things about Sarah. She had stopped trying to make herself feel simple things about Sarah. Malcolm was 2 seats to Amani's right, in the suit that finally fit, because Loretta had taken it to her tailor 3 weeks ago without asking permission, and Malcolm had received the altered jacket with the expression of a man who understood that some corrections arrived without being requested and were correct regardless. He had his hands on the table in front of him, and he was looking straight ahead and breathing through his nose the way he breathed when he was managing something physical. Amani put her hand on the table close enough to his that the sides of their hands were touching. He did not look at her. He pressed his hand slightly toward hers, a millimeter of pressure, and kept looking forward. That was enough. Taijin was already at the defense table when she took her seat. She saw him in profile first. The controlled posture, the jaw that never loosened publicly. I was wearing a dark suit she had not seen before, new, she thought, bought for this occasion, which told her something she already knew about the specific performance of composure he was maintaining. When you buy new clothes for a proceeding you expect to survive, you are still thinking about afterward. You are still planning. Then he turned. She had expected the looking. She had prepared for it, had practiced, in the quiet of her own mind, the specific neutrality of expression she would maintain when it happened. What she had not prepared for was the particular quality of what was in his face when he found hers across the room. It was not the calculated calm she'd seen in the estate corridor on Saturday morning 8 weeks ago. It was not the constructed composure of the man who had sent Warren Chu to negotiate damage control. It was something older than both of those things, something that had no operational function and therefore told the truth in the way that functionless things do. He looked like a man who understood, finally and completely, the precise dimensions of what he had done. Not the legal dimensions, those he had understood for weeks. The other dimensions, the ones that lived in the gap between a strategy and a person. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. She looked back with an expression that was not forgiveness, and was not hatred, and was not grief. It was the expression of a woman who had read 63 pages of her own exploitation and had filed them in the correct folder and had come here today to say the last thing that needed to be said publicly so that the record was complete and the matter was closed. Then she looked at Camille's folder and did not look at him again. The first day of proceedings established the architecture of Project Crown for the public record in the way that the documentary evidence made possible, comprehensively, specifically, with the particular clarity of a case where the primary defendant had provided the most damning account himself. The prosecution moved through the stages methodically: the relationship cultivation, the legal infiltration, the contract amendments, the signature forgery operation, the voicemail to Gerald. They played Taijin's voice on a recording from a federal court speaker system, and it filled the room with the same measured precision it had filled Sarah's private device 18 months earlier, when he had described Amani as a structure, and the room absorbed it with the particular silence of people hearing something they will not forget regardless of what they decide to do with it. Amani sat and listened to his voice describe her and felt the cost of it move through her body the way cold moves. Not all at once, but progressively, reaching places you forgot were exposed. She did not let it show. This was not suppression. Suppression stores what it denies. This was something else. The deliberate decision of a person who had already paid the private cost and was here today for the public accounting, and those were 2 separate tasks requiring 2 separate conditions. She had done the private cost in the terminal office at 2 in the morning, reading 87 pages. She had done it in the restaurant with Malcolm when she couldn't eat. She had done it alone in her father's chair looking at the lake with the specific understanding that the man she had loved had studied her grief and filed it under resources. She had already paid. This was the receipt. On the second day, Gerald Okafor testified. He came in wearing a dark gray suit she recognized, the same one he'd worn to Raymond's funeral. She did not know if that was intentional. She chose to believe it was, because the alternative was that it was accidental, and some things deserve to be chosen rather than coincidental. He sat in the witness chair with his hands folded in his lap and his face arranged in the expression of a man who had decided to tell the complete truth and had understood that deciding to tell it and actually telling it were two different physical experiences and that the second one was harder than the first. He answered every question directly. He did not minimize. He did not redirect. When the prosecution asked him to describe the November phone call, the call where Taijin had described his family's situation with specific accuracy and then changed the subject, Gerald's voice dropped half a register and then steadied itself with the visible effort of a man who had learned the difference between breaking and bending and had chosen bending. He described what Taijin had said about his son and his daughter-in-law. He described the change of subject. He described how he had understood the call and what he had told himself about it, and how the gap between what he understood and what he told himself had been the space where everything wrong had been allowed to happen. When the defense cross-examined him, they tried the bilateral scheme argument, the suggestion that Gerald had been a participant rather than a coerced party, that his continued cooperation with Taijin's organization after November indicated willingness rather than pressure. Gerald answered each question in the same, even, complete sentences. He acknowledged the payments. He acknowledged that he had reviewed documents he should have refused. He did not dress any of it up, or mitigate any of it, or provide any version other than what had actually happened. He did not look at Amani during any of this. She understood. Looking at her would have undone him, and she did not want him undone. She wanted him finished, wanted him through to the other side of this testimony, because he was 62 years old and he had served her father with genuine loyalty for 11 years before a man with better resources and a longer timeline had identified that loyalty and converted it into a point of entry. And the Gerald who sat in that witness chair was not primarily the man who had failed to say no to Taijin. It was primarily the man who had written 31 handwritten pages and called Camille and said, "Here is everything. Don't protect me from any of it." That was also who he was. Both things were true. Amani had decided to hold both of them. On the third day, the defense presented its case, and it was well constructed in the way that skilled attorneys build cases around the best available material, which in this instance was limited because the best available material had been voluntarily handed to the prosecution by the defendant himself, but limitation had never prevented skilled attorneys from building what they could with what remained. Their argument organized itself around the distinction between intent and outcome, the suggestion that Taijin had envisioned a legitimate strategic partnership that certain participants had operationalized through methods he had not explicitly sanctioned, and that his cooperation agreement demonstrated the response of a man who, upon understanding the full scope of what had been done, had chosen accountability over self-protection. They did not call it remorse. They called it responsibility. The jury, from what Amani could read of 12 faces maintaining professional opacity, did not appear to find the distinction as significant as the defense hoped. On the fourth day, she gave her statement. She had written it herself, in the terminal office, on a Tuesday night after Nadia was asleep. She had been with Darius for 8 months by then, and their daughter was 2, and the terminal was running well, and the fellowship had launched its second cohort, and Amani had understood that she needed to write the statement from the place she currently inhabited rather than the place she had occupied 8 weeks earlier, because the place she currently inhabited was harder and quieter and more honest about what had actually been lost and what had actually been found, and what the difference between those two things cost. She stood at the podium. The room had the specific quality of held breath. She looked at the jury, she looked at the gallery, she looked briefly at the defense table. Not at Taijin, at the table itself, at the wood surface and the water glasses and the neat stacks of legal paper that represented the formal structure of a dispute she was about to step outside of for the last time. Then she spoke. She did not talk about love. She did not talk about the corridor or the dress or the recording. Those things were in the record. They did not need her voice to make them real. She talked about a signature. She talked about what her father had taught her a signature meant. Not the legal definition, the human one. The act of a person saying, "I have read and understood and I freely choose this." Three things in sequence: understanding, then freedom, then choice. Remove any one of them, and what remains is not consent. It is a mark without the person behind it. She talked about what Taijin's operation had taken. Not the terminal. They had not gotten the terminal. Not the legal contest. They had not won that either. What they had taken, and what could not be returned through any verdict, was the specific period of time during which she had believed she was freely choosing a future with a person who was freely choosing one with her. 14 months. She had been free in those months, but the freedom had been a condition he had engineered and maintained because her free belief in the relationship was the mechanism that made everything else possible. She had not been deceived about him. She had been deceived about herself, about the conditions of her own choosing. That was what no verdict restored. "I am not asking this court to repair what cannot be repaired," she said. "I am asking it to name what was done so the record knows it, not what it felt like, what it was." She paused. The pause arrived without planning, and she let it be there because it was carrying weight, and that weight belonged in the room. This was not a man who lied to a woman he loved. Men lie to women they love. That is old and painful and human, and it is not why I am standing here. She looked at the jury directly. This was a man who identified a woman's capacity for commitment as a structural vulnerability, who engineered conditions to activate that capacity in the direction of his own interests, and who prepared documents bearing her signature. Her signature, the mark of her autonomous will. To formalize a transfer of authority she had never considered and would never have agreed to. She stopped. "Heartbreak is not a crime. I am not prosecuting heartbreak." Her voice did not waver, but something in it changed register, moved from controlled legal statement into something closer to the actual human cost of the thing. "I am here because someone took the act of my consent and made it serve a plan I never knew about. Because someone looked at the fact that I would protect what I loved and decided that made me a door, not a person. And because if that has a name in the law, if the law has language for the difference between a person being deceived and a person's will being manufactured without them, then I want that language used today, out loud, in this room, in the record." She looked at the table one more time. Then she sat down. The room held its silence for 2 seconds longer than courtroom silences typically held. Then it released, and the ordinary procedural sounds of a legal proceeding reassembled themselves. And Imani looked at Camille's folder and felt the specific exhaustion of having said something completely, with nothing left out, in the right room at the right time. Malcolm's hand found hers under the table. He held it, the way he had held it in the emergency room when their father's heart had announced the first warning, the way he'd held it in the funeral car, the way he'd held it in the moments when the Caldwell family had faced something that required two people holding on to each other, so neither one of them went somewhere unreachable alone. She held it back. The jury deliberated for 7 hours and 19 minutes. They returned 3 counts: fraudulent use of a digital signature, attempted financial deception through document manipulation, and coercion of a material witness in the matter of Gerald Okafor. The financial penalties were structured around the operational value of what had been attempted, significant enough to be real, significant enough to matter. The professional restrictions removed him from any legitimate role in logistics, freight, or related financial services for a period that measured in years. The probationary conditions were extensive and monitored. He did not go to prison. Imani had known this was the probable outcome before the verdict was read. She had known it since Camille had explained the cooperation agreement's structure, that full voluntary disclosure carried a price for the prosecution as much as the defendant, that the value of 63 pages of detailed methodology to Torres's broader federal investigation was worth the trade in incarceration. The calculation was not wrong. The other companies Project Crown had targeted needed the information those 63 pages contained. The operational network that had funded and sustained the operation needed the financial tracing that Tae-jin's disclosure made possible. Greater accountability required the specific sacrifice of this one. She had understood all of this. Understanding it did not make standing in the corridor outside the courtroom, watching his attorneys collect their materials with the careful efficiency of people who had expected this outcome and were ready to move to the next phase, feel like the clean ending the word verdict implied. It felt like the true ending, which was different. True endings were not clean. They were complete, which meant they contained everything, the parts that resolved and the parts that didn't, the justice that arrived and the restoration that couldn't. the costs paid, and the ones that had already been spent before the accounting started. Malcolm stood beside her in the corridor and said nothing for a long time. Then, "You want food?" She looked at him. "I'm genuinely hungry," he said. "I didn't eat this morning because I couldn't, and now I can and I want to. That's the entire reason." Something in her chest that had been held at significant tension for 7 hours released, and what replaced it was not joy, and was not grief, and was not the complex middle ground between them. It was simply the recognition of her brother standing in a courthouse corridor in an altered suit being exactly himself, and that was, in this moment, the most stabilizing thing available. "Yes," she said, "let's go eat." They went to the place near the terminal, Raymond's place, which was also now theirs. The booth with the vinyl seats and the menu that held its ground against the years, and the light that came through the front windows in the afternoon, with the specific quality of a room that had decided what it was. They ordered. They ate. Malcolm's order was what he always ordered. Imani ordered what her father used to order and did not explain it to Malcolm, and did not need to. For the first 20 minutes, they talked about the warehouse conversion, which Darius had completed on schedule 3 weeks earlier, and which had passed its occupancy inspection with 3 minor corrections and 0 major ones. They talked about the fellowship's second cohort, which was 8 months in and had already produced 2 policy recommendations that Imani was considering adopting for Caldwell Freight's vendor management. They talked about Loretta, who had returned from Portugal with photographs she showed everyone without being asked, and a quality of rested ease that Imani had not seen in her mother since before her father's first cardiac event. Then Malcolm set down his fork and looked at her with the expression he used when he was going to say the thing he'd been holding since the courthouse steps. "She's going to need to know," he said. "Nadia, when she's old enough." Imani nodded. She had been thinking about this for months. Not anxiously, with the deliberateness of someone planning a conversation that mattered and wanted to have it right. "Not the legal case," Malcolm said. "That's in the record. She can read the record when she's ready for it. I mean," he picked up his coffee, "the part you taught, the fellowship, what it actually is." "I know what you mean. Because she's going to inherit the terminal, and she's going to love things the way you love things, the way Dad loved things, and someone is going to notice that eventually, and it's going to look like an opening." "I know. So she needs to know how to—" "Malcolm." Imani looked at him steadily. "I know. I'm going to tell her, not as a warning, as information." She paused. "There's a difference between teaching someone to fear and teaching someone to read. I'm going to teach her to read." He looked at her. "The way you taught yourself to read it," he said. Not a question. "The way Saturday taught me," she said, "which is the version I didn't want. But I have it now, and she'll have it from me, and that's better." He nodded. Once, slowly. The way he nodded when something had completed itself and didn't need more discussion. Outside, the October city moved through its afternoon with the thoroughness of a place that had never once paused for any individual's outcome. Imani watched it through the window and felt something she had not felt on the courthouse steps. Something quieter, less about the verdict and more about the morning after the verdict and the morning after that. The specific texture of a future that was hers to determine rather than someone else's to engineer. That evening, she went to the warehouse. The conversion was finished. The interior had been stripped and rebuilt, the drainage corrected, the east wall properly reinforced, the open floor plan suited to the training sessions that would begin in January. The building smelled like new wood and fresh paint, and the particular specific emptiness of a space that had been prepared for people who hadn't arrived yet. Darius was there. He was in the southwest corner with a level and a notepad, doing the final documentation that he did at the end of every project. The record of what had been done, what had been corrected, what the building was now carrying, and how. He looked up when she came in and took one look at her face and put the level down and crossed the floor. He did not ask how it went. He had read enough about the case in the weeks since the filing to understand the probable outcome, and he understood Imani well enough by now to know that what she needed in this moment was not a question. He put both arms around her and she let herself be held, which was something she had been practicing. The permission to be held, the specific vulnerability of allowing another person's body to take some of the weight for a moment without converting that allowance into a debt or a danger. She stood in the finished warehouse with her face against Darius Monroe's shoulder and breathed. 4 slow breaths. 5. Then she stepped back because she had finished needing to be held, and she knew the difference now between finishing and suppressing, and this was finishing. "It's done," she said. "I know," he said. "Not the way I wanted it to end." "No." She looked around the empty warehouse, at the corrected floor, at the east wall bearing its load properly, at the windows that let in the late afternoon light. The way windows do when the frame has been set correctly, when the building is telling the truth about what it is. "He's going to rebuild something," she said. "Not the same thing. He doesn't have the infrastructure anymore. But someone like him doesn't stop because of a verdict. He recalculates." "I know. And I'm not going to spend my time tracking it." She looked at Darius directly. "I'm going to spend my time making what I have so solid that the recalculation doesn't lead here. That's the actual work." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of respect. Not admiration, not sympathy, but the specific regard of a person who has assessed the structural integrity of what you've built and found it sound. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. They drove home separately. He had materials to return to a supplier, and she had a call with Camille at 6. And Amani drove through the city in the specific quiet of a person who has said everything that needed to be said in every room that needed it said, and is now moving through the aftermath, which is less dramatic than the event and more real. The call with Camille lasted 40 minutes. Torres's federal investigation had expanded, as they had both anticipated, into the methodology Teijin's disclosure had detailed. 2 of the companies Project Crown had targeted were now aware of the compromised contract conditions in their existing agreements. One had already begun remediation. The other's board was still in the early stages of understanding what they were looking at, which Camille described with the specific neutral patience of an attorney who had watched organizations absorb bad news at different speeds and had learned not to rush the process. "Your documentation," Camille said, near the end of the call, "specifically the dual authorization protocol and the fellowship curriculum. Torres's team has requested copies, not for the case, for a guidance framework they're developing for companies in sectors that have experienced similar targeting." Amani absorbed this. "He can have them," she said. "Everything. The protocol, the curriculum, the vendor assessment framework we built from the audit. All of it." She paused. "Tell him the fellowship is also open to participation from any company whose employees would benefit. That was always the intent. He'll appreciate that." "It's not generosity," Amani said. "It's architecture. The more places this knowledge lives, the harder it is to use ignorance as a point of entry." Camille was quiet for a moment. "Your father would have liked the way you think about this." The statement was unexpected in its directness. Camille was not typically a person who made personal observations during professional calls. Imani held it for a moment before responding. "He thought about it differently," she said. "He thought about loyalty and trust as the things that made business possible. I think about consent and transparency as the things that make loyalty safe." She paused. "We were coming at it from different directions. I think we'd have ended up at the same place." "I think so too," Camille said. After the call, Imani sat in her home office for a while with the light off and the window showing the dark yard and the neighbor's light through the trees. The compass charm was on the corner of her desk. She picked it up and turned it in her fingers. The small silver compass from the estate's planning materials, which pointed north regardless of who was holding it or what they had intended when they handed it to her. She had kept it for reasons she had not fully understood when she kept it, and understood better now. It was not a memento of Teijin. It was not a reminder of the Saturday, or the corridor, or the recording. It was a reminder of the specific principle that direction is not owned by whoever points you toward it. North is north, regardless of the person holding the compass. True things are true regardless of the person who helps you find them, even if the way they helped you find them was by trying to take them. She set it back on the desk corner. Then she went to check on Nadia, who was 18 months old and sleeping in the position she always slept in, arms flung sideways, face arranged in the absolute authority of a person with nothing currently requiring management. Imani stood in the doorway and watched her breathe with the particular quality of attention that arrived without deciding to. The attention of a parent watching a child be exactly themselves in the most unguarded possible way. She thought about what she would tell her someday. Not yet. Years from now, when the right version of the right words existed and Nadia was old enough to receive them without being frightened by them. She would tell her about signatures, about what they mean and what they require, the understanding, the freedom, the choice. In that order, all three, nothing missing. She would tell her that understanding someone completely was not the same as having the right to use what you understood, and that the difference between those two things was exactly the width of consent freely given. She would tell her about the corridor. Maybe. About the 20 minutes that had changed the direction of everything, and what had actually happened in those 20 minutes. Not the drama of it, not the shock, but the specific sequence of decisions Imani had made when the shock cleared. She had listened. She had recorded. She had read before signing. She had believed her own perception over the explanation offered to replace it. She would tell her that those were not exceptional acts of heroism. They were ordinary acts of a person refusing to be managed out of their own clear sight. That was all they were. And that ordinary acts, committed at the right moment, were the thing that everything else depended on. She closed Nadia's door softly and went to bed. 3 months later, on a cold Tuesday in January, the fellowship launched its second cohort in the converted warehouse. 12 participants, ranging from 26 to 41, from industries that included freight, real estate, family medicine, and agricultural supply. They came from 3 different states. They had in common the fact of inherited or soon-to-be inherited assets, and the specific vulnerability of not having been trained to understand the ways that inheritance could be targeted through the people who trusted most. Imani taught the first session herself. She stood in the space that Darius had made honest. The corrected drainage, the properly bearing walls, the windows that let in the winter light, at the angle that the frame, once fixed, made possible. And she looked at 12 people who were looking at her with the specific attentiveness of people who had come because something in the description of what was being taught had identified something they already half knew but hadn't found language for. She started with consent, not the legal definition, the human one. She talked about the 3 things that had to be present simultaneously for a choice to be genuinely yours. Understanding what you were agreeing to, freedom from conditions that would compromise your ability to refuse, and the actual act of choosing. She talked about how each of those 3 things could be compromised in ways that were invisible until they weren't, and about how the invisibility was often the point. She did not tell them her story. She did not need to. The curriculum was the story, distilled into the parts that could be carried out of this room and into the rooms where the actual living happened. What had happened to her was her own. She had filed it in the correct folder and it lived there, complete and true, and no longer requiring her active energy to hold its shape. What she was giving them was the part that didn't belong to her alone. The session lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, a 31-year-old woman who had inherited a regional agricultural distribution company from her grandfather asked, "How do you know when someone genuinely understands what you love versus when they're mapping it?" Imani thought about it for a moment, not performing the thought, actually thinking it. "You don't always know," she said. "Not in real time." That's the honest answer. She looked at the woman directly. But there are signs. People who genuinely understand what you love ask questions that cost them something. They tell you inconvenient truths when lying would be easier. They accept your refusal without recalibrating their approach. She paused. People who are mapping your love ask questions that give them something. They agree with everything until the moment they need you to agree with them. They are very, very patient with your boundaries right up until the boundaries start to cost them. The woman was quiet for a moment. "That's how you know?" she said. "That's how you start to notice," Imani said. "And noticing is the whole thing, not certainty, not proof, just the willingness to believe your own perception when it tells you something doesn't sit right, before you've received the explanation designed to replace it." The woman nodded, slowly. The nod of someone receiving information that is rearranging something they already half held. After the session ended and the participants had gone, Imani sat alone in the warehouse for a while with her coat on because the building was still cold in January, and the heating system was new and had not yet learned the space. She sat in a folding chair in the center of the floor and looked at the windows and the winter light coming through them at the correct angle and breathed. She thought about her father. Not with grief exactly, with the specific quality of connection that replaces grief when grief has been fully done. The sense of a person's continued presence, not as an ache but as an inheritance. The way certain ways of thinking and certain ways of paying attention get passed from one person to the next, and become part of how the next person moves through the world. Raymond Caldwell had built a freight terminal from a leased warehouse and a second-hand truck and 30 years of honoring what he agreed to. He had not built it by being naive. He had built it by understanding that the alternative to trust was a kind of smallness that cost more than trust did, even when trust occasionally failed. And he had been right about that. Imani knew he had been right about that, not despite what had happened, but because of it. Because she had learned what it cost to have her trust engineered rather than offered, and had understood that the cost of the engineering was higher than the cost of the original trust would ever have been. She was going to keep trusting, carefully, with the specific care of someone who had learned the difference between faith and naivety, which was not the absence of risk, but the presence of clear eyes. She was going to keep choosing people who told her inconvenient truths and signed the documents and asked the questions and were exactly who they appeared to be in the rooms where no one was watching. She was going to keep being someone her daughter could receive an inheritance from, not just the terminal, not just the buildings and the contracts and the updated vendor protocols. The other inheritance, the one about how to hold what you love without letting the holding become the mechanism of its loss. She got up from the folding chair and walked to the east wall and put her hand flat against it. Darius had shown her this when the reinforcement was finished, had brought her to this spot and put her hand on the surface and told her to feel the difference. Before the reinforcement, the wall had given slightly under pressure, a barely perceptible flex that meant the load was being distributed incorrectly, that something somewhere in the structure was compensating for a weakness it hadn't been built to compensate for. After the reinforcement, the wall was still. Not rigid, still. The difference between a thing braced against failure and a thing built to bear what it was bearing. She felt it now. The stillness. Then she picked up her bag and her coat and walked to the door and turned off the lights, and stood for a moment in the entry with the dark warehouse behind her and the winter street in front of her and the city doing its indifferent necessary work in all directions. She stepped out. The door closed behind her. The months moved the way months move when the crisis has resolved and the work continues. Not dramatically, not in the rhythm of escalation and climax, but in the patient accumulative way of things that are being built correctly. The fellowship completed its second cohort and enrolled its third. The dual authorization protocol ran without incident and caught language anomalies in 2 vendor contracts that might otherwise have passed unexamined. The warehouse became what it had been repurposed to become. Tajin's name appeared in news coverage twice in the following year. Once when Torres's federal investigation produced indictments of 3 members of the operational network that had executed Project Crown's document forgery, and once when a logistics company in Milwaukee disclosed that it had discovered compromised contract language consistent with the methodology described in the Project Crown documentation and was beginning remediation. Both times, Imani read the reporting once and then moved to the next thing. He sent the letter 14 months after the verdict. 2 pages, handwritten, plain paper. He wrote that he had spent the intervening time in the specific condition of a person trying to understand the gap between what they thought they were doing and what they were actually doing, and that the gap had turned out to be larger and more significant than he had been able to see while he was inside the architecture of the thing. He wrote that he had confused the desire for connection with the execution of control, and that he understood now those were not adjacent impulses but opposing ones, and that the substitution of one for the other was the entire crime, not just the legal one. He wrote, "You deserve to be seen without being assessed. I did both at once, and convinced myself they were the same act. They were not." Imani read it twice. She did not read it a third time. She placed it in the legal archive, in the physical case file that lived in a fire-safe box in her office, alongside the forensic analysis and the cooperation agreement, and Gerald's 31 pages, and the transcript of the corridor recording, and the photograph of the forged addendum. Everything that documented what had happened, organized in the correct folder, complete and true. The letter was not among her father's things. It was not in the drawer with personal correspondence. It was not beside the compass charm on the corner of her desk. It was in the evidence file. That was where it was accurate. That was where it belonged. On a Wednesday morning in May, 5 years after the Saturday that had ended differently, Imani sat in her father's chair at the terminal and watched the lake do something unusual. The surface had gone completely calm in the early morning light, flat and clear and reflective. showing the sky back to itself with the specific honesty of still water that has nothing to hide. She updated the weather log. 2 sentences. Clear this morning. Everything that was here before is still here, and it holds. She closed the note. Below the window, the dock was running, the morning shift, the freight moving, the workers whose names she knew and whose rhythms she had learned the way her father had learned them, by walking the floor before the administrative day began, by keeping honest. The terminal was stronger than it had been before Taijin had tried to take it, because the attempt had revealed weaknesses in the structure that she had then corrected, and corrected structures bear more than they were built to bear. She thought about the ivory dress. It had been donated 8 months after the verdict. A non-profit organization that provided professional clothing for women rebuilding after financial and domestic crisis. An organization Imani had located through Camille, who had located it through Sarah, which was an indirection she found appropriate. She had brought the dress in herself, without ceremony, and a woman at the intake counter had noted its quality and condition and folded it with care and said it would go quickly. Imani had thought, good. Somewhere in the city, or possibly in another city by now, the material of that dress was covering the shoulders of a woman building the next version of her life. The fabric that had been designed to be the architecture of a ceremony that became something else entirely had been repurposed into the architecture of something else entirely. That seemed correct? That seemed like the right use of a thing. Darius came in at 8 with 2 cups of coffee. The right place, the place near the east entrance that had been her father's, and set one on her desk and sat down across from her and looked at the lake through the window. Clear today, he said. I know, she said. I put it in the log. He looked at her with the expression she knew as his version of complete attention. No performance, no calculation, just a person directing themselves entirely toward another person without anything else running underneath. You okay? He said. She considered the question, not performing the consideration, actually sitting with it for a moment, taking its full measure. Yes, she said. And it was true in this way that things are true when they have been earned rather than assumed, not perfect, not without the weight of everything that had made them possible, but genuine and solid and pointing in the right direction regardless of who was holding it. She picked up her coffee. Outside, the lake held the morning in its surface, patient and indifferent and enormous, the way it always did. Below the window, the terminal ran. In the East Wing office, Arieze Nwosu was already at her desk, learning the rhythm of a company she had come to with her own hands and her own record, and a willingness to ask the questions that cost something. In the warehouse on the south side, the 3rd fellowship cohort would gather in 6 weeks. In the fire-safe box in the corner of the room, the case file sat complete and closed, requiring nothing further. And in a house in Lincoln Park, a 3-year-old named Nadia was waking up in the position she always slept in, preparing to have strong opinions about breakfast, inheriting a world that her mother was making more honest, one corrected structure at a time. Imani drank her coffee. She turned to the morning's work, and the lake, behind her, held still.